The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched earth of McGill, Nevada, and Felicity Jenkins knew she had made a terrible mistake leaving town alone without enough water. But pride had driven her forward, and now that same pride might kill her. Her vision blurred as she stumbled toward the old well she had spotted from the ridge, her canteen empty for the last 2 miles, her lips cracked and bleeding. The September heat of 1882 was unforgiving, and the landscape shimmered with waves of heat that made everything look like a cruel mirage. Felicity's traveling dress clung to her body, soaked through with sweat, and her bonnet hung uselessly down her back, the string still tied around her throat, feeling like it was choking her. She had left the boarding house that morning determined to walk to the neighboring ranch to inquire about work as a seamstress, convinced she could manage the 5-mile journey despite the warnings from the boarding house keeper. Felicity had been in McGill for only 3 weeks, having traveled from Missouri after her father's death left her with nothing but debts and the clothes on her back. At 22 years old, she had learned to be independent, perhaps too independent for her own good. The well grew closer, and Felicity forced her legs to keep moving even as they trembled beneath her. Just a few more steps, just a little further. The world tilted sideways, and she reached out to grab the wooden frame of the well, her fingers scraping against the rough timber. The bucket hung on its rope, and she tried to reach for the crank, but her hands would not cooperate. They felt like they belonged to someone else, clumsy and weak. Darkness crept in from the edges of her vision, turning the bright afternoon into a narrowing tunnel. Felicity heard herself make a sound, something between a gasp and a sob, and then the ground rushed up to meet her. She collapsed in a heap beside the well, dust rising around her like a ghost, and knew nothing more. Russell Irving had been tracking the wild Mustang for 3 days, and he was beginning to think the damn horse was smarter than he was. The stallion's hoofprints led him across his property and onto the stretch of scrubland that bordered the main trail to McGill, a section of land he rarely visited since there was little grazing here and even less water. But he knew the old well was out this way, built years ago by prospectors who had long since moved on or died trying to strike it rich. At 30 years old, Russell had lived in Nevada for most of his life, having come west with his parents as a child. They had died within a year of each other when he was 19, leaving him the ranch and a loneliness that had only deepened with time. He had built his life around the cattle and horses, finding purpose in the work but little joy. The few attempts he had made at courting women in town had failed miserably, his quiet nature and rough edges not appealing to ladies who wanted poetry and proper manners. His horse, a sturdy buckskin gelding named Scout, suddenly nickered and tossed his head, ears pricked forward. Russell sat up straighter in the saddle, his hand instinctively moving to the rifle in its scabbard. Out here, anything could mean danger, rattlesnakes, bandits, or worse. But as Scout picked his way around a stand of scrub brush, Russell saw something that made his heart lurch in his chest. A woman lay crumpled beside the old well like a broken doll, her brown hair spilled across the dirt, one arm stretched out as if still reaching for help. Russell was off his horse before he fully registered what he was doing, his boots hitting the ground hard as he ran toward her. He dropped to his knees beside her, his rough hands surprisingly gentle as he turned her onto her back. She was young, maybe early 20s, with a face that would have been pretty if it were not so pale and drawn. Her lips were cracked and bleeding, her skin hot to the touch despite the pallor. Sunstroke, dehydration, maybe both. Russell had seen men die from less in this unforgiving country. He grabbed his canteen from his belt and carefully lifted her head, supporting it in the crook of his arm as he dribbled a small amount of water onto her lips. "Come on," he murmured, his voice rough from disuse. He rarely spoke except to his animals. "Come on, miss, you need to wake up." She did not respond, but her throat worked slightly as the water touched her lips, an automatic reflex that gave him hope. Russell knew he could not give her too much too fast, or she would just bring it back up. He needed to get her out of the sun, get her cooled down, and get more water into her slowly. The nearest town was McGill, but that was a hard hour's ride from here, and his ranch was only 20 minutes if he pushed Scout. The decision made itself. Russell corked his canteen and hung it back on his belt, then slid his arms beneath the woman, one under her knees and one behind her shoulders. She was lighter than he expected, and as he stood with her cradled against his chest, he felt something twist in his heart at how fragile she felt. Her head lolled against his shoulder, and a small sound escaped her lips, somewhere between a whimper and a sigh. "I have got you," Russell said softly, surprised at the emotion in his own voice. "You are going to be all right." Getting her onto Scout was a challenge, but Russell managed it, holding her across the saddle in front of him as he mounted. He kept one arm locked around her waist, holding her secure against his chest as he urged Scout into a smooth canter. Every instinct screamed at him to ride faster, but he could not risk jostling her too much or dropping her. The ride back to his ranch felt like it took forever, each minute stretching into an eternity. Russell found himself talking to her, a constant stream of reassurance that he hoped on some level she could hear. He told her about the ranch, about the creek that ran behind his house, about how he would get her cooled down and comfortable. He did not know if she could hear him, but the sound of his own voice seemed to help him focus. His ranch came into view, a modest spread with a sturdy log house, a barn, and a few outbuildings. It was not much, but Russell kept it in good repair, and it had always been enough for him. Now, looking at it with this unconscious woman in his arms, he suddenly saw it through different eyes. It looked lonely. It looked like exactly what it was, the home of a man who lived entirely alone. Russell rode right up to the porch and dismounted carefully, taking her weight again as he carried her up the steps and kicked the door open. Inside, the house was dim and blessedly cooler than the outside. He had built it with thick walls specifically to keep out the heat, and for once he was grateful for his own foresight. His bedroom was the first door off the main living area, and he carried her there, laying her carefully on his bed. The sheets were clean. He had just changed them 2 days ago, and the room smelled faintly of the lavender his mother had planted years ago that still grew wild around the house. Russell stepped back, suddenly aware that he had brought a strange woman into his home, into his bedroom, and had no idea what to do next. Water. She needed water and cooling down. Russell stripped off his dusty leather gloves and tossed them aside, then went to the kitchen to pump water into a basin. He found clean cloths and brought everything back to the bedroom, setting the basin on the small table beside his bed. He hesitated, looking down at her. She was still unconscious, her breathing shallow but steady. Her traveling dress was heavy and certainly not helping her cool down, but Russell could not bring himself to undress her. That would be beyond improper. Instead, he compromised, unlacing her boots and pulling them off, then loosening the collar of her dress and the ties of her corset through the fabric, just enough to let her breathe easier. Russell dipped a cloth in the cool water and wrung it out, then began to carefully wipe her face and neck. The cloth came away dirty and he rinsed it and tried again. Slowly, the grime of travel and dust began to disappear, revealing pale skin beneath. He worked methodically, cooling her forehead, her temples, the pulse point at her throat. He soaked another cloth and laid it across her forehead, then wet another and placed it on the back of her neck. After what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes, She stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and Russell found himself holding his breath. Her eyes opened slowly, unfocused at first, and then widened in confusion and fear as she registered where she was, and that a strange man was leaning over her. Felicity tried to sit up, panic flooding through her, but her body would not cooperate. She managed to lift her head a few inches before exhaustion pulled her back down. "Where?" she croaked, her voice barely audible. "You are safe," Russell said quickly, holding up his hands to show he meant no harm. "I found you collapsed at the old well about an hour ago. I brought you to my ranch. You were suffering from heat and dehydration. I have been trying to cool you down." Felicity's eyes darted around the room, taking in the simple furnishings, the masculine space, and then back to the man beside her bed. He was tall, she could tell even with him sitting, with broad shoulders and work-hardened hands. His face was tanned and weathered, with dark hair that needed a cut and eyes that were a surprising shade of blue. He looked worried, she realized, genuinely worried. "Water," she whispered. Russell immediately reached for his canteen, supporting her head again as he held it to her lips. "Slowly," he warned. "Just small sips or you will be sick." Felicity wanted to gulp the water down, her body screaming for it, but she forced herself to follow his instructions. The water was the most delicious thing she had ever tasted, and she wanted to cry with relief. After a few sips, Russell pulled the canteen away despite her small sound of protest. "More in a few minutes," he said firmly. "I promise, but you need to go slow." Felicity let her head fall back against the pillow, exhausted from even that small effort. "Thank you," she managed. "I thought I was going to die." "You might have," Russell said honestly. "What were you doing out there alone?" Shame colored her cheeks. "I was walking to the Henderson Ranch. I heard they might need a seamstress. I thought I could manage the distance." Russell shook his head. "That is at least 5 miles in this heat. You did not bring enough water." "I did not have enough water to bring," Felicity admitted. "I only had one small canteen." Something in the way she said it made Russell look at her more closely. She had the look of someone down on their luck, someone who had been forced to make do with less. Her dress, while clean and carefully mended, was worn thin in places. Her hands, when he had carried her, had been soft but showed recent signs of hard work. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice gentler. "Felicity Jenkins." She met his eyes, lifting her chin slightly despite her weakness. "I arrived in McGill 3 weeks ago from Missouri." "Russell Irving," he offered in return. "This is my ranch. You are welcome to stay until you are recovered." Felicity's eyes filled with tears and she blinked rapidly, clearly fighting them back. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Irving. I am sorry to be such a burden." "You are not a burden," Russell said, and was surprised to find he meant it. There was something about this woman, even in her weakened state, that drew him, a strength beneath the fragility. "You need rest and water and food. I can provide all of that, and you can call me Russell." Over the next few days, Felicity slowly regained her strength under Russell's careful attention. He proved to be a surprisingly good caretaker, bringing her broth and bread, helping her sit up to drink water, changing the cool cloths on her forehead. By the second day, she was able to sit up on her own and even take a few shaky steps around the room with his support. Russell found himself drawn to his own house in a way he had not been in years. Where before he had spent most of his time outside, working with the cattle and horses, now he found excuses to come inside, to check on Felicity, to bring her something to eat, to ask if she needed anything. He told himself it was just the decent thing to do, that any man would do the same, but he knew it was more than that. Felicity, for her part, was equally confused by her feelings. She should have been uncomfortable, staying in a strange man's home, sleeping in his bed while he took the small cot in the other room. But instead, she felt safe in a way she had not felt since before her father died. Russell was quiet and reserved, but there was a fundamental kindness in him that shone through in everything he did. On the third day, Felicity insisted on getting up and sitting in the main room. Russell helped her to the worn leather chair by the fireplace, and she looked around with interest at his home. It was clean but sparse, clearly the home of a man who lived alone and did not see the point in excess. But there were small touches that spoke of the people who had lived here before him. A quilt folded over the back of the sofa that must have been made by a woman's hand, a shelf of books that looked well-read, a few small carved figures on the mantel that might have been childhood treasures. "Your mother's work?" Felicity asked, gesturing to the quilt. Russell looked surprised that she had guessed. "Yes, she made it the winter before she died, said every home needed something beautiful in it." "She was right," Felicity said softly. "It is beautiful." Russell made coffee, strong and black, and brought her a cup. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, and Felicity found herself relaxing in a way she had not been able to since arriving in Nevada. In McGill, she had been constantly worried about money, about finding work, about where her next meal would come from. Here, with Russell, those worries seemed distant. "Can I ask you something?" Russell said finally, his hands wrapped around his own coffee cup. "Of course." "Why Nevada? Why come all this way alone?" Felicity took a sip of her coffee, gathering her thoughts. "My father died 6 months ago. He had debts I did not know about. After everything was settled, there was nothing left. I had an aunt in Missouri who let me stay with her for a while, but she made it clear I was not welcome permanently. I heard there were opportunities out west, towns that needed seamstresses and teachers and cooks, so I came." "That took courage," Russell said. Felicity laughed, but it was tinged with bitterness. "Courage or desperation, I am not sure which." "Both, maybe," Russell said. He hesitated, then added, "The Henderson Ranch is not a good place, especially not for a woman alone." Felicity looked at him sharply. "What do you mean?" Russell's jaw tightened. "Henderson is not a good man. He goes through hired help quickly, and there have been rumors about how he treats women who work for him. I would not want to see you go there." Felicity felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. "I appreciate the warning. But I do need work, Russell. I cannot just stay here forever living off your charity." "It is not charity," Russell said quickly. Then, more quietly, "I like having you here." The admission hung in the air between them, and Felicity felt her heart skip. Russell looked almost embarrassed, staring down into his coffee cup, and she realized that this was probably the most personal thing he had said to another person in a long time. "I like being here," Felicity said softly. "You have been very kind to me." Russell looked up and their eyes met. For a moment, something passed between them, an understanding, a connection. Then Russell looked away, clearing his throat. "You should rest more. You are not fully recovered yet." But Felicity found she did not want to go back to the bedroom. She wanted to stay here in this room with this man who had saved her life and asked for nothing in return. So she did, and they talked as the afternoon wore on, sharing stories of their lives. Russell told her about growing up on the ranch, about his parents and how much he had loved them. Felicity talked about Missouri, about her father who had been a clerk and had tried his best after her mother died when Felicity was young. As the sun began to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink visible through the windows, Russell made them dinner. It was simple fare, beans and salt pork with biscuits, but Felicity ate with genuine enjoyment. Everything tasted better here somehow. Over the next week, Felicity grew stronger. She began helping around the house, insisting that if she was going to stay, she would earn her keep. Russell protested at first, but Felicity was stubborn, and soon she had taken over the cooking and cleaning. The house, which had always been merely functional, began to feel like a home. She found wildflowers and put them in a jar on the table. She darned his socks and mended his shirts. She made proper meals with vegetables from the small garden behind the house that had been mostly neglected. Russell, in turn, found himself looking forward to coming inside at the end of the day, where before he had often just collapsed on his bed, exhausted and alone. Now he had someone to talk to. Felicity was easy to be around, with a quiet sense of humor and a sharp intelligence that he appreciated. She asked him about the ranch, about the cattle and horses, and actually listened to his answers with genuine interest. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the stars come out, Felicity said, "I should probably go back to McGill soon, start looking for work again." Russell felt his heart sink, but he kept his voice neutral. "If that is what you want." "It is not about what I want," Felicity said. "I cannot just live here indefinitely. People will talk. It is not proper." "Let them talk," Russell said, surprising himself with the vehemence in his voice. Then more quietly, "Stay, please." Felicity turned to look at him, and in the dim light from the house her eyes were dark and fathomless. "Russell, I cannot just stay here without purpose, without some understanding of what this is." Russell took a deep breath, gathering his courage. He had never been good with words, had never known how to express what he felt. But looking at Felicity now, he knew he had to try. "I have been alone for a long time. I thought that was just how my life was going to be, and then I found you at that well and everything changed. These past weeks, having you here, it has been like waking up from a long sleep. I do not want to go back to the way things were. I do not want to be alone anymore." Felicity's breath caught. "What are you saying?" "I am saying that I have feelings for you," Russell said, the words coming easier now that he had started. "I know we have not known each other long, and I know I am not the kind of man women usually fall for. I am rough and quiet, and I do not have much to offer except this ranch and a lot of hard work. But if you would consider staying, if you would consider letting me court you properly, I would do everything in my power to make you happy." Felicity felt tears spring to her eyes, but they were good tears this time. "Russell, I have feelings for you too. I think I have since that first day when I woke up and saw how worried you were about me. I have never felt as safe or as cared for as I do here with you." Russell reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and took hers. His palm was calloused and rough, but his touch was gentle. "So you will stay? You will let me court you?" "Yes," Felicity said, smiling through her tears. "Yes, I will stay." Russell felt like his heart might burst from his chest. Acting on impulse, something he rarely did, he leaned in and kissed her. It was chaste and sweet, a barely there press of lips, but it sealed something between them. When he pulled back, they were both smiling. The courting that followed was old-fashioned and proper, despite the fact that they were living under the same roof. Russell moved his things permanently to the small back room, giving Felicity the main bedroom. They were careful about appearances, and when Russell did go into town for supplies, he made sure people knew that Miss Jenkins was staying at his ranch as a housekeeper while she recovered from her ordeal. The truth was more complicated and more wonderful. They were falling in love, slowly and steadily, learning each other in the way that only people who share a life can. Felicity learned that Russell hummed tunelessly when he was working on something he enjoyed, that he had a sweet tooth for her apple pie, that he was scared of disappointing people, which was why he kept to himself so much. Russell learned that Felicity talked to herself when she was concentrating, that she loved thunderstorms, that she had a temper when roused but was quick to forgive. They worked side by side on the ranch, Felicity proving to be surprisingly capable with the animals. She helped him with the horses, learning to ride on an old mare named Clover that was gentle and patient. She fed the chickens and collected eggs, tended the garden until it flourished, even helped with branding when Russell brought the cattle in closer to the house for the season. In the evenings, they would sit together, sometimes reading aloud from Russell's collection of books, sometimes just talking about their days or their plans for the ranch. Russell found himself sharing dreams he had never told anyone, ideas for expanding the herd, for breeding better horses. Felicity listened and offered suggestions, and Russell realized that this was what partnership felt like. This was what he had been missing all these years. 2 months after Russell had found Felicity at the well, he rode into McGill with a specific purpose. He went to the small jewelry shop run by an old German immigrant named Mr. Hoffman and looked at the rings in the case. They were mostly simple bands, nothing fancy, but one caught his eye. It was silver with a small inset stone, a piece of turquoise that reminded him of the Nevada sky. "That one," Russell said, pointing. "How much?" Mr. Hoffman quoted a price that made Russell wince, but he paid it without arguing. This was important. This was for Felicity. He tucked the small box carefully into his pocket and rode home with his heart pounding. He had planned to wait, to propose properly maybe at Christmas or in the spring when the wildflowers bloomed. But when he got home and saw Felicity in the kitchen, flour dusting her cheeks as she rolled out dough for biscuits, humming to herself, he could not wait another moment. "Felicity," he said, and something in his voice made her turn, her eyes widening. "What is wrong?" "Nothing is wrong," Russell said. He crossed the kitchen in 3 long strides and took her hand, getting flour on his own in the process. "Everything is right. That is the problem. Everything has been right since you came into my life, and I cannot imagine it any other way now." Felicity's free hand came up to cover her mouth. "Russell," he pulled the small box from his pocket and opened it, the turquoise catching the afternoon light streaming through the window. "I know we have not been courting long by traditional standards. I know some people might say we should wait longer. But I am 30 years old, Felicity, and I have never felt about anyone the way I feel about you. I do not want to wait. I want to marry you. I want you to be my wife, to build a life here together. Will you marry me?" Felicity was crying now, tears streaming down her cheeks, but she was smiling too. "Yes," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Yes, Russell, I will marry you." Russell slipped the ring onto her finger with trembling hands, and then he was pulling her into his arms, kissing her properly this time. Felicity kissed him back, her arms wrapping around his neck, and for a long moment they just held each other in the flour-dusted kitchen while the afternoon sun painted everything gold. They were married 3 weeks later in the small church in McGill. It was a simple ceremony with few attendees: the preacher, his wife who served as witness, and a couple of Russell's neighbors who he had invited out of courtesy. Felicity wore a dress she had made herself from fabric Russell had insisted on buying her, a soft blue that brought out her eyes. Russell wore his best shirt and pants, his hair freshly cut, looking more nervous than Felicity had ever seen him. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Russell kissed her with a reverence that made Felicity's heart swell. They were married. They were truly married. She was Felicity Irving now, and this cowboy who had carried her home from the well was her husband. The wedding night was tender and sweet, Russell patient and gentle with Felicity's nervousness. They came together in the bed that had first been his alone, then hers during her recovery, and now belonged to both of them. Afterward, Russell held her close, stroking her hair, murmuring how much he loved her. Felicity had never felt so cherished, so wanted, so home. Their first year of marriage was not without challenges. The ranch required constant work, and there were times when money was tight. A harsh winter tested them, forcing Russell to dig into his carefully saved funds to buy feed for the cattle. Felicity's sewing skills proved invaluable, and she began taking in mending work from people in McGill, providing a small but steady additional income. But through it all, they had each other. When Russell came in exhausted from a long day of mending fences in the cold, Felicity had hot food and a warm fire waiting. When Felicity felt overwhelmed by the isolation, Russell would hold her and remind her that she was not alone anymore. They talked through their problems, made decisions together, learned to compromise and support each other. In the spring, Felicity realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks but had not been sure until the sickness started. She told Russell one morning over breakfast, simply and directly, watching his face carefully for his reaction. Russell's eyes went wide, his coffee cup frozen halfway to his mouth. "Pregnant, you are sure?" "As sure as I can be without seeing a doctor," Felicity said. "Are you happy about it?" Russell set his cup down carefully, then got up and came around the table. He pulled Felicity to her feet and into his arms, holding her like she was the most precious thing in the world. "Happy?" His voice was thick with emotion. "Felicity, I am more than happy. I am terrified and amazed and grateful all at once." Felicity laughed, relief flooding through her. "Good, because I am all of those things too." Russell pulled back just enough to kiss her, his hand coming up to cup her cheek. "We are going to be parents," he said wonderingly. "We are going to have a baby." The pregnancy progressed smoothly despite Felicity's initial worries. She continued to work, though Russell tried to get her to rest more, fussing over her in a way that was both endearing and occasionally frustrating. He was constantly afraid she was overexerting herself, trying to take over all her chores in addition to his own. "Russell, I am pregnant, not broken," Felicity said one day in exasperation when he tried to carry a basket of laundry for her. "Women have been having babies since the beginning of time. I can carry a basket." "I know that," Russell said, but he did not let go of the basket. "Humor me anyway." Felicity could not help but smile. She knew his protectiveness came from love, from the fear of losing this happiness they had built. So she let him carry the basket and fuss over her, and in return, she made sure he knew how much she appreciated him. As her belly grew, Russell would sometimes place his hand on it in the evenings, marveling at the life growing inside. The first time he felt the baby kick, his expression was one of pure wonder, and Felicity fell in love with him all over again. Their son was born in December of 1883, during a cold snap that had Russell terrified something would go wrong. Felicity labored for 12 hours with the help of a midwife Russell had brought from McGill, a stern but capable woman named Mrs. Chen. Russell paced outside the bedroom door, useless and anxious, until he heard the first cry of his child. The midwife opened the door, her stern face softened into a smile. "You have a son, Mr. Irving, a healthy boy, and your wife did beautifully." Russell practically ran into the room. Felicity lay in the bed, exhausted but radiant, holding a small bundle wrapped in blankets. She looked up as Russell entered, tears streaming down her face, and held out the baby to him. "Meet your son," she whispered. Russell took the baby with shaking hands, looking down at the tiny red face, the miniature fingers that curled around his thumb. Something cracked open in his chest, a well of love so deep he could not fathom it. "He is perfect," Russell said, his voice breaking. "You are both perfect." They named him Robert, after Russell's father, with the middle name James for Felicity's father. Little Robert proved to be a good baby, sleeping well and eating heartily. Russell was a devoted father, often getting up in the night with him so Felicity could rest, walking the floor with his son against his shoulder, humming those tuneless songs. Watching Russell with their son, Felicity felt a contentment she had never imagined possible. This life, this family, had come from such an unlikely beginning. If she had not collapsed at that well, if Russell had not found her, where would she be now? The thought was sobering and made her grateful every day for the twist of fate that had brought them together. As Robert grew into a toddler, sturdy and curious, Felicity found herself pregnant again. Their daughter, Rose, was born in the summer of 1885, an easier birth than Robert had been. She came into the world with a lusty cry and a head of dark hair, and Russell declared she was the most beautiful thing he had ever seen next to her mother. The ranch prospered as their family grew. Russell expanded the herd, brought in better breeding stock, and developed a reputation for quality horses. Felicity's sewing had grown into a small business, with women coming from McGill and even farther afield for her work. They built an addition onto the house, creating more space for their growing family. Life was not always easy. Robert came down with a fever when he was 3 that had them both terrified until it broke. There was a drought one summer that stressed the cattle and forced them to make hard decisions. Russell broke his arm falling from a horse and had to rely on Felicity to handle more of the ranch work while he healed. But they weathered each challenge together, their bond growing stronger with each trial overcome. On their 5th wedding anniversary, Russell surprised Felicity with a trip back to the old well where he had found her. They rode out together, leaving the children with Mrs. Chen for the day. The well looked the same as it had that day, weather-beaten and lonely in the vast scrubland. They stood together looking at it, Russell's arm around Felicity's waist. "Do you ever think about what would have happened if I had not been tracking that Mustang that day?" Russell asked. "All the time," Felicity admitted. "I think about how close I came to dying out here, and how that one moment changed everything." "I think about it too," Russell said. He turned her to face him, his hands resting on her shoulders. "I was tracking a wild horse and found my whole future instead. Best day of my life, even though at the time I was terrified you would not make it." "You saved my life," Felicity said, reaching up to cup his cheek. "But more than that, you gave me a life worth living. You gave me a home and a family and love. So much love, Russell." Russell pulled her close, resting his chin on top of her head. "You saved me too. I was just existing before you came along. Now I am living." They stayed at the well for a while longer, remembering, before riding back home to their children and their life together. The well remained a special place for them, a reminder of where their story began. Over the years, the ranch continued to grow and prosper. Russell took on a hired hand to help with the increasing workload, a young man named Tom who proved reliable and hardworking. Felicity taught Rose to sew when she was old enough, and the little girl showed a natural talent for it. Robert followed his father everywhere, learning the ranch work with eager enthusiasm. They added 2 more children to their family, another son named Henry in 1888, and finally another daughter, Clara, in 1890. Their house, which had once been so empty and lonely, was now filled with the noise and chaos of children. Russell sometimes joked that he could not remember what silence sounded like, but his eyes would be soft when he said it, full of love for his loud, messy family. In 1892, 10 years after Russell had found Felicity at the well, they threw a party to celebrate. Neighbors from miles around came, filling their property with wagons and horses. There was food and music, dancing and laughter. Their children ran wild with the other kids, and Russell and Felicity stood on their porch watching it all with satisfaction. "Can you believe it has been 10 years?" Felicity asked, leaning against Russell's solid warmth. "Feels like yesterday and forever ago all at once," Russell said. He looked down at her, and his eyes were the same blue that had looked at her with such concern that first day. "I love you more now than I did the day we married, and I loved you plenty then." "I love you too," Felicity said. "Thank you for carrying me home that day, Russell. Thank you for carrying me into your lonely heart and making room for me there." Russell kissed her, not caring who might see, and Felicity kissed him back. Around them, their life continued in all its beautiful, chaotic glory. As the years continued to pass, Russell and Felicity settled into a comfortable rhythm of life. The children grew, each developing their own personalities and dreams. Robert, true to his nature, wanted nothing more than to take over the ranch someday. He had his father's quiet strength and his mother's determination. Rose proved to be not just talented at sewing but also at drawing and painting, covering scraps of paper with her artwork. Henry was the most outgoing of their children, already talking at age 4 about wanting to see the world beyond Nevada. Clara, still a toddler, was fiercely independent and kept them all on their toes. The ranch itself had become one of the most respected in the area. Russell's horses were sought after, his cattle healthy and well tended. He had expanded their land holdings over the years, buying adjacent parcels when they became available. What had once been a lonely outpost was now a thriving operation that employed several hands year-round. Felicity's sewing had evolved as well. She now focused on custom pieces for special occasions: wedding dresses, christening gowns, fancy shirts for men who had made their fortunes in the mining towns. Her work was known for its quality and artistry, and she commanded prices that contributed significantly to the family's income. She had even trained 2 young women from McGill as apprentices, passing on her skills to the next generation. But more than their material success, it was the love they had built that sustained them. Russell still looked at Felicity with that same wonder he had felt when he first realized he was falling for her. Felicity still felt her heart skip when Russell came in from the range, dusty and tired but smiling when he saw her. They had built something real and lasting, something that went beyond the romance of their early days into the deep, abiding love of true partnership. In 1895, tragedy struck when Russell's closest neighbor, an old rancher named Samuel who had been kind to them over the years, died suddenly. His widow decided to move back east to live with her daughter, and she offered to sell their ranch to Russell at a fair price. It was an opportunity that would double their land holdings, but it would also stretch their finances dangerously thin. Russell and Felicity talked long into the night about the decision. They sat at their kitchen table, the same table where they had shared so many meals and conversations over the years, weighing the risks and rewards. "It is a huge risk," Russell said, running his hands through his hair, a gesture Felicity recognized as a sign of his stress. "If we have a bad year or two, we could lose everything." "We could," Felicity agreed, "but we could also build something even stronger. Something to pass down to Robert and the other children, security for them and their families someday." Russell looked at her, and in his eyes, she saw the same faith that had led him to propose after only 2 months of courting. "You think we should do it?" "I think we have faced challenges before and overcome them together," Felicity said, reaching across the table to take his hand. "I think we are stronger together than we are apart, and I think if anyone can make this work, it is us." They bought the land. It was a hard few years, making the payments and keeping both properties running smoothly. Russell worked from dawn until well past dusk most days. Felicity took on extra sewing work, her fingers often cramping from the long hours. But they managed, and gradually the investment began to pay off. The additional grazing land meant they could support a larger herd. The water rights that came with the property were invaluable during the dry summers. By 1898, they were not just stable but genuinely prosperous. They could afford luxuries they had never considered before. A new stove for Felicity that did not require constant attention, proper school books for the children, even a piano that Rose had begged for and which she practiced on every day. Russell hired a foreman, taking some of the daily burden off his shoulders. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset as they had done countless times before, Felicity said, "Do you ever wonder what your life would have been like if you had not found me that day?" Russell was quiet for a moment, considering. "I think I would have just continued on the way I was, working the ranch, living alone, growing old by myself. I probably would have been content enough. I did not know what I was missing." He turned to look at her, his eyes serious. "But I would not have been happy, not like this. You showed me what happiness actually is, Felicity." Felicity felt tears prick her eyes. After all these years, Russell could still move her to tears with his honest declarations. "You did the same for me. I came to Nevada desperate and alone, thinking I would be lucky to find work that would keep me fed. Instead, I found everything." Robert came out onto the porch then, now a strapping young man of 15. "Dad, that mare is about to foal. I think you should come look." Russell stood, then hesitated, looking at Felicity. She smiled and waved him on. "Go, I will be here when you get back." She watched her husband and son walk toward the barn together, their strides matched, their heads bent in conversation about the mare and the foaling. Pride filled her chest, along with gratitude so profound it was almost painful. This life, this beautiful, messy, wonderful life, had started with a moment of weakness and desperation at an old well. The years continued their steady march forward. Robert married at 21 to a sweet girl from McGill named Sarah, and they built a house on the far edge of the property. Rose, to everyone's surprise, moved to San Francisco to study art, sending home letters filled with excitement about the city and her classes. Henry joined the army, fulfilling his dream of seeing the world. Clara, their youngest, stayed close to home and proved to have a natural gift with horses that exceeded even her father's. Russell and Felicity became grandparents when Robert and Sarah had their first child, a boy they named Russell Jr. Holding his grandson for the first time, Russell felt the same overwhelming love he had felt when each of his own children was born. The cycle was continuing, the family growing, the legacy building. In 1905, now in their 40s, Russell and Felicity took a trip to San Francisco to visit Rose. It was the farthest Felicity had traveled since coming to Nevada all those years ago, and the first time Russell had left the state since he was a child. They spent a week seeing the sights, attending an exhibition of Rose's artwork, and marveling at how different city life was from their ranch. But as wonderful as the visit was, they were both relieved to return home. The ranch, the land, the life they had built there, that was where they belonged. As their train pulled into the station in McGill, and they saw Clara waiting with the wagon to collect them, they both felt it, the pull of home, stronger than any wanderlust. The years of their 50s brought changes. Russell's hair turned fully gray, though he remained strong and active. Felicity found herself needing reading glasses for her sewing work. They slowed down somewhat, though Russell still rode out every day to check on the cattle and horses, and Felicity still took on sewing projects, though fewer than before. They had grandchildren now in abundance. Robert and Sarah had 4 children, and Henry, who had left the army and settled in Montana, had 2. Rose had married an artist in San Francisco, and they had 1 daughter. Clara married one of the ranch hands, a good man named Peter, and they lived in the foreman's house and were expecting their first child. Russell and Felicity's house, while quieter than it had been when their own children were young, was never truly empty. Grandchildren visited frequently, filling the rooms with laughter and energy. On Sundays, the whole family would gather for dinner, and the table Russell had built years ago would be surrounded by 3 generations. In 1910, as they approached 30 years since Russell had found Felicity at the well, they decided to ride out there one more time. They were both still capable riders, though they chose their gentlest horses these days. The well, impossibly, looked even more weathered than it had on their last visit, the wood graying and cracking with age. They dismounted and stood hand in hand, looking at the place where their story had begun. "Almost 30 years," Felicity said softly. "It does not seem possible." "Best 30 years of my life," Russell said. His voice was gruffer now with age, but the emotion in it was the same as always. "Mine too," Felicity agreed. She leaned against him and Russell wrapped his arm around her. They were both a bit softer, a bit slower than they had been, but the connection between them was as strong as ever. "I sometimes think about that scared young woman who collapsed here," Felicity said. "She would not believe her life turned out like this. And that lonely cowboy who found her had no idea he was about to find his whole world," Russell added. He turned her to face him, taking both her hands in his. "Thank you, Felicity, for saying yes when I asked you to stay, for building this life with me, for being my partner in everything." "Thank you for carrying me home," Felicity said, the words echoing what she had said years ago at their anniversary party. "And for never letting me go." They kissed there beside the well, two people who had grown old together, who had built a family and a legacy, who had turned a chance encounter into a lifetime of love. The years continued to pass, bringing both joys and sorrows. Russell's health began to decline in his 60s, his joints stiff with arthritis from decades of hard ranch work. Felicity developed a cough that worried everyone until the doctor assured them it was nothing serious, just a consequence of the dry climate. They slowed down further, relying more on Robert and Clara to manage the daily operations of the ranch, but they were content. They had their children and grandchildren, some now living far away, but all staying in touch through letters and visits. They had the ranch that had sustained them for so long. And most importantly, they had each other. On a cool evening in November of 1915, Russell and Felicity sat on their porch wrapped in blankets, watching the stars come out. It was a ritual they had maintained throughout their marriage, these quiet moments together at the end of the day. "I have been thinking," Russell said, breaking the comfortable silence, "about my life, about what matters." Felicity turned to look at him, noting the thoughtful expression on his weathered face. "What brought this on?" "Robert asked me today what I wanted him to do with the ranch after I am gone," Russell said. "It got me thinking about legacy, about what we leave behind." "And what did you decide?" Felicity asked gently. Russell gestured at the land spread out before them, barely visible in the gathering darkness but as familiar to them as their own reflections. "This is good. The ranch, the land, what we built here. It will sustain the family for generations if they are smart about it. That is a good legacy." He turned to Felicity, taking her hand. "But that is not what I am most proud of. What I am most proud of is this, us. The family we raised, the love we shared. That is what matters, Felicity. Not the acres or the cattle or the money in the bank. It is the love." Felicity squeezed his hand, her eyes filling with tears. "We did good, did we not? Despite how it started with me half dead and you all alone, we built something beautiful." "We did," Russell agreed. "We built something that will last long after we are gone. And I would not change a single thing about it." They sat in silence for a while longer, two people who had spent more than 3 decades loving each other, facing the future with the same courage they had faced every challenge. They had grown old together, built a life together, and created a love story that their children and grandchildren would tell for generations. As the stars brightened overhead, the same stars that had watched over them since that first night when Russell had kept vigil over Felicity's recovery, they remained on the porch. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new joys, new moments to treasure. But tonight, they had this: each other, the land they loved, and the peace that came from a life well lived and a love well earned. The ranch that had once been the lonely domain of a solitary cowboy was now filled with life and laughter, carrying forward the legacy of that chance encounter at an old well when fate had brought two lost souls together and given them everything they needed: each other. And so the years continued their gentle passage, each day a gift, each moment together a treasure. Russell and Felicity Irving, who had started their story with a collapse and a rescue, would continue it hand in hand until their final days, proof that sometimes the best love stories begin with a simple act of kindness and a lonely heart ready to open. Their children would remember them not as perfect people, but as perfectly matched partners who loved each other through everything life brought them. And on quiet evenings, when the family gathered on that same porch, someone would always tell the story of how it began, with a woman who collapsed at a well and a cowboy who carried her home and into his lonely heart, where she remained forever.